Broadcasting from the commodity capital of the world, Zurich, Switzerland, this is Insider's Guide to Energy.
This edition to Insider's Guide to Energy is brought to you by Fidectis. Go to www.fidectis.com for more information.
Welcome to Insider's Guide to Energy. I'm your host, Chris Sass, and with me, as always, is Johan Oberg, my co-host. Johan, what's going on?
Good afternoon, Chris. Great to be on. Looking forward to another show. How are you doing?
I am doing fantastic. I'm sitting here drinking a Guinness and starting a podcast. What more could I ask for in life?
I missed something with the Guinness. I'm still in my water, but I got a little bit more work to do. I might binge one later on.
All right. Well, everyone else has got big boy drinks, but I think we're going to talk about storage today instead of our beers. And you know, this is an energy podcast. I think that's going to be more the topic that I'm interested in, as you probably know from previous conversations. I'm looking forward to finding out what our guest has to say today.
I think so as well. I think we've discussed storage in a number of different ways, more traditional storage, more from a hardware point of view. But I'm curious about this one today because it has some elements maybe that we haven't discussed on the show, and especially looking at the combination of storage and digital. So we'll see where it ends up, but looking forward to it. And then, as we did in the pre-show, we're sitting in fairly cold Switzerland, and we're joined by someone in a much, much nicer climate in Florida. But enough of that. Maybe we should welcome to the show Cheech Ragsdale. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, fellas. It's fantastic to be here. I've listened to the podcast across a few different countries, so you guys are always with me.
We appreciate that. Now, if you are only listening to the podcast, this is our first interview done from a balcony over South Beach. So one of the three of us, not me, is probably sitting in a nice climate this winter and enjoying some South Florida weather. So, Tej, more power to you for being there. But other than your name, our guests don't know much about you yet. So perhaps we should start with a little bit about who you are and a little bit of your background.
Sure, happy to. So I'm one of three co-founders of Entheos. Entheos is really a workflow process that allows for the different stakeholders in energy storage to find one another and to transact successfully, driving towards successful battery projects. We can get a little into that later. My background is really in nitty-gritty finance. I started my career trading commercial mortgage-backed securities for about 3 years, then jumped into crypto and helped a large DeFi protocol called MakerDAO build out effectively their lending arm that lent crypto dollars against real-world assets like corporate loans, commercial real estate, and renewable energy projects. Left that a few months ago to found Entheos with my co-founders, and here we are.
So Entheos is a young startup with three co-founders that seem to come from technology backgrounds of all different bents. Is that your?
Yeah, exactly.
DNA?
So Entheos proper is about 6 months old, but we acquired a Norwegian deep tech startup by the name of Hoggle the end of last year, and Hoggle really builds a frontier battery management system that we'll get into a little bit later. But yeah, the three co-founders, we all come from very different backgrounds, and I think as we continue the conversation, it'll be obvious how each founder's distinct background sort of fits into the puzzle that is the Entheos network. But sort of our first co-founder, Christian Ringvold, sort of a renewables veteran, has built lithium-ion battery factories across Europe, and then started working on this technology, this battery management system, what we call the Rebel Core Controller, in about 2018. So his background is really in renewables and deep tech. That's his expertise. Second co-founder, Marijn Terheggen, he founded a company called HackerOne. It's effectively a marketplace for big companies looking to kind of secure their software and their applications to find hackers in a allied and friendly way. And then if those hackers find vulnerabilities, they're rewarded with a bug bounty. And HackerOne really secures an enormous part of the internet today. So his background is really in building these Web2 marketplaces and designing incentives such that different stakeholders can work together towards a common goal. And then my background, by far the least prolific, is in finance, just pretty traditional Wall Street finance, as well as building out the real-world asset arm of a crypto protocol.
Yeah. So interesting to hear the backgrounds, and I think it relates to us as well. That runs the Insider's Guide to Energy show, because we also came from different industries and started then to looking into the energy industry, mainly because of the transformation. But before we go in more in terms of the solutions and the value that's created, I was a little bit curious. You mentioned your two co-founders that has the IT expertise and the renewable expertise, and you're the Wall Street guy that came in, went to crypto, and why renewables, or why energy?
Yeah, so look, I started my career kind of, the market sort of decided for me what I would do, right? I graduated from a decent school and everyone went into finance or consulting. And so I went and did that, right? But after about 3 years, I started to think about, what problems I really wanted to solve, what problems I really wanted to give myself to. And going into crypto was really, the place I worked, MakerDAO, it was a sovereign issuer of currency on chain, right? It was trying to reimagine a better financial system such that people, particularly those that lived in unpredictable and sort of corrupt monetary regimes, could access synthetic US dollars, right? So money to me is one of the biggest, most critical infrastructural problems on Earth. And I spent 2 years trying to sort of build out that new sovereign currency issuer. And we made a really big dent. It's a huge protocol, tens of billions of dollars in value. And then the next most important problem, or the more important problem on Earth, is really energy. And I saw this opportunity to go and join these guys, Mariah and Christian, and really build out a platform and an interface that allowed storage to proliferate in the way that sort of the sustainable revolution really needed. And that problem seemed too large and too obvious for me to possibly not go and give my life to. So that's where we are today.
So one of the things that your literature says, and in our pre-conversation when I spoke to you the other day, is you're making storage as a service, right? So, we know software as a service. What does storage as a service mean to you?
Sure. So it's a an obvious reference to software as a service. It even has the same acronym. But the idea here is very similar to sort of the computing revolution. At one point, businesses had their own servers, right? They owned their own compute. They managed that process. But if we accelerate to today, AWS interacts with customers, manages those servers, and sells them compute for a monthly fee, which is much more manageable and reasonable for a business trying to scale. So what we say is, the grids across the globe need this sort of time machine for electrons to manage the increasing intermittency of the supply side and the explosion on the demand side through the electrification of vehicles and real estate. But for the most part, even with this battery management system that we build that makes batteries more performant and more efficient, a commercial and industrial sized battery is still a significant capital outlay, right? After 2021, 2022, businesses realized that they would really benefit from having storage on-prem, right? To hedge them against the variability in their local grids. But not everyone can afford to put up, 80, 100, 150 grand outside of their grocery store or outside of their ice rink. And so what we say is, well, we see this obvious need in the market, all these tailwinds going into storage, right? Biggest climate bills. We see storage growing, 75x over the next 10 years. How do we drop the barrier to entry such that the middle market, folks that aren't flush with cash, can access storage? And the way to do it, right, is to separate the beneficiary of that storage, the customer, from the owner of the storage, which is an external investor. And as the storage does its thing, as it drives savings to the customer, the customer pays some portion of those savings to the owner of that battery. So it really drops the hurdles for acquisitions of new customers and drops the barrier for sort of the middle market and long tail of businesses to access the storage that, frankly, big businesses have been accustomed to for a while.
You said the owner of the storage, or owner of that. So is that implying your company's the owner of the storage, or is this an investment vehicle based on where you come from?
So yes, you've cut right to the chase. So it's the latter, right? So Entheos is really sitting in sort of a facilitatory role where we connect these various stakeholders and enable these battery projects to come to fruition. So it will in fact be a platform, really a marketplace, that allows for external investors in the short term, family offices, energy funds, those with a thesis and a familiarity with the space, to go out and browse different commercial situations, different jurisdictions, and invest in these battery projects, right? And then the battery projects will be peak shaving or be selling back into the grid, creating some sort of income. And that income will primarily be shared with the owner of the battery, who then sort of is fulfilling their mandate as an institutional manager of capital.
So that's the investment of the batteries to get the kind of the infrastructure on site, which I kind of follow you on that one. But help me to understand a little bit more, apart from maybe doing the financing around the asset itself. So what becomes your role? Because we're also talking about the software part of this one. It's just not one battery, start connecting them. So help me to understand a little bit about the ecosystem around it that you sit in.
Sure. Yeah, so we really see our role as two-pronged. So one is, we not only manage and build this platform that allows these different parties to find one another and drive towards successful projects, but we also build a piece of frontier technology that actually enhances the performance of these batteries notably, right? So if we look out in the world today, there are plenty of industrial scale C&I batteries out there, right? They're expensive. They have roughly 10-year lives. What we say is, hey, we've developed this technology that you, customer, benefit from. It makes your battery less lossy. It eliminates the AC-DC conversion losses. And it drops your CapEx because our single cell control technology enables us to use lower grade, recycled, non-EV compliant cells. So what you've done here is right off the bat, because of this innovation that Christian has built over the last 5 years, you've turned a battery from a good asset into a great asset, right? And when you do that, it makes the battery a more investable and desirable asset for investors. And then on that second prong is really, you have a series of different stakeholders, right? You have battery developers / operators, you have the OEMs, manufacturers, you have the customers looking for storage as a service, and then you have the investors. Right, and to date, the way that investors have interacted with energy broadly is either you invest in sort of a whitelisted ESG fund. We kind of saw how that worked with BlackRock, having exposure to Gazprom and the rest. Not a judgment statement, just it was unclear to investors if this was really ESG. And then on the other side is this idea of project finance, right? Fairly constrained, illiquid, required a very specific thesis to get into. On our side, what we do is we take the various stakeholders that are needed to set up a battery, to get that battery cash flowing, and we give them a nice trusted platform to find one another, to exchange value, and to really drive more business to their individual businesses than they would get if they went about this on their own.
So when you're talking about finding themselves, and I'm just trying to understand as well, I thought that's really interesting because I think one of the, obviously we see with the whole prosumers and the way we're now starting to go into, if we call it microgrids, or at least starting to be self-sufficient in one way or the other, we start producing. It's a key part of this renewable energy. But when you say finding each other, is this regional? Is there software kind of a matchmaking process, or is this basically that you have the local capabilities of the batteries in a specific area and people connect to that? Or how does this finding kind of work?
Yeah, sure. So let's dive into kind of the workflow, or how a battery project goes from 0 to 1, right? So the kind of key first persona in this matrix is the idea of a battery developer. Now, our battery developers are kind of slightly different than our historical conception of what a battery developer does. In our case, what a battery developer is really doing is they're going out there in the market and they're identifying a commercial opportunity to install commercial industrial storage. So for example, they find a certain jurisdiction. That jurisdiction has significant variability in grid pricing, right? Pretty brutal peaks and pretty low troughs. That gives you a huge opportunity to put a battery in there behind the meter, a battery that can buy at the troughs and discharge to our customers at the peaks. In any case, what that battery developer is doing is they're sourcing deals. They're providing an investment memo to the network of stakeholders in an effort to bring that battery project to the capital liquidity providers and push that project towards completion. Once a project is funded by an investor, and this is going to be a hedge fund, a family office that has a particular thesis that maybe they like that jurisdiction, they believe the variability in that grid will sustain for long periods of time, meaning the income generating potential of that battery will sustain for long periods of time. They fund that battery project. An order gets sent to an OEM. What an OEM then does is they package our software within the pack, ship the pack off to the battery developer. Battery developer implements the pack, is responsible for O&M. And then, of course, our customer has access to their storage as a service, whether it's an ice rink, a food distributor, et cetera. The customer is then paying on a monthly basis some portion of those savings, very similar to the way solar works, at least in the States. And those payments are distributed as per the waterfall to the various stakeholders. So that will be majority to the investor, but some will go to the battery developer. And then, of course, Entheos has a platform fee at the end of the day.
When we spoke, you mentioned that you have a footprint in both North America and in Europe right now. What's the differences in the market for this kind of volatility between the European market and the North American market?
Yeah, so I think, broadly in Europe, what you see is they're about, I don't know, maybe you guys would know better than I, 5 to 8 years ahead in terms of the renewable revolution as the States are. And so what that kind of means is in these grids, you have a larger penetration of renewable resources on the supply side. And so if you think about, solar and wind, right, you have an abundance of solar midday, typically an abundance of wind midnight. And those renewable power producers typically don't have a market to sell into, or at least not as big of a market to sell into at those times. So what that means is if you have a battery, a behind the meter resource that can acquire energy at those troughs and then discharge to our customers during the peaks, preventing them from having to draw from the grid when everyone else is, there's some pretty significant savings in that. And we see that kind of disconnect between a really intermittent supply side and the electrification of the demand side being particularly prevalent, especially in places like Norway, which 75, 80% of the cars sold are already EVs. I think in the States, it's a little bit different. I think there are great markets that are deregulated where, those arbitrage opportunities are pretty big. But I also think, particularly in places like California and Texas, the space is fairly saturated already with virtual power plant operators and folks like that. With that said, I think the subsidies and the sort of the regulatory support in the States is much stronger. There's a lot more money on the table. And if you think about what our model does, right, is similar again to the way solar works. When a solar developer comes and installs PV on your roof, you're not owning that. And you don't really own the economics or the incentives to that either, right? So in our model, an external investor owns these battery assets. The customer gets what they need, which is reliable, stable, cheap energy. But the investor benefits from, for example, the standalone or co-located storage ITC today. So I think in the States, there are certain key tailwinds, namely on the regulatory side. And I think Europe, there are great tailwinds, namely on the composition of supply plus the development of electrification. On top of that, for us, our roots and our history are in Norway. That's where Christian's built his business and his life and his family. And so a lot of Norwegian companies, Scandinavian companies, European companies are tracking our progress. And so the sort of the uptake and the customer acquisition there is kind of organic due to that cachet in that market.
One thing you said that I don't think I caught, you said Norway had significant EVs. Yes, true. Isn't that a competitor to what you do? Because suddenly I have all kinds of storage capacity. If everyone in the US suddenly gets an EV tomorrow, they can choose to charge that in the middle of the night when wind is higher. They can choose to charge it during the middle of the day when I'm in the office, right? And plug in at my office at a meter outside. So is that a competitor to what you do, or is that complementary to what you're doing?
Yeah, so I think, Chris, what you're alluding to is as vehicle to grid, the bidirectionality of that kind of gets fleshed out. Aren't there all these storage resources coming into the energy matrix that are ostensibly competitors with what you do? And I think that is the case. I think if you think about our focus in terms of which customers we serve, there's a very clear differential between the vehicle to grid storage capacity and the storage capacity we provide. So on the vehicle to grid side, I think most of the infrastructure is focused around either at home vehicle to grid or charging station vehicle to grid. Whereas what we do is really focused on the commercial and industrial customer that needs a rather large battery behind the meter that can autonomously read spot markets, fill itself up when prices are low, and discharge when prices are high. And also the C rates of those need to be really high, right? And what our technology really allows for is fairly demanding use cases. Think about some of these customers. A grocery store, high cooling bills, they have their freezers on all the time. It's demanding, but it's nothing like a mill or a factory or a sports arena. In those use cases, you need a fairly high C rate, and you don't want that battery to erode and degrade over time. And what single cell control really allows you to do is very, very granularly monitor and speak to each individual cell so you don't overcharge and discharge any individual one, which gives you a nice long life and a good asset. But look, for us, the space is absolutely enormous. We need all kinds of entrepreneurs building all kinds of storage implementations of all kinds of different chemistries, different form factors, all of it, right? There's such a huge problem to solve here that as vehicle to grid proliferates, it only galvanizes us to be even better and see how we can work with those people.
So you mentioned something in your answer again that triggered something. You're creating a marketplace, but you're a software company too, right? So help me understand the software as a service, the software that you offer that helps manage all this. Because, right, you just talked about managing individual cells in a battery pack. That's not a thing that's done generally today. So I assume that, and you talked about when you go to your OEM, I think in a previous answer, it's bundled with your software. Help me understand a bit more about your software.
Sure. So as listeners to the podcast will know, every battery is equipped with a battery management system that directs how that battery charges and discharges. Historically, most, at least commercial industrial scale batteries, all of the cells charge and discharge in series, right? You can think about them as one homogeneous lump. Either you're discharging or you're charging. That's fairly limiting because what that does is it constrains the performance of that pack by that of its weakest cell, right? If one cell has a 70% capacity, you're not going to be able to charge the other cells with additional capacity beyond that 70%. And that leaves kilowatt hours and money on the table. So what these guys developed, what our teams developed, is a battery management system that we call the Rebel Core Controller that not only monitors individual cells, but it speaks to individual cells. And that does some interesting things for you. The think most interesting for the purposes of understanding how OEMs fit with our platform is if you can speak to each and every individual cell, you can use cells of much higher variability. Think about what goes into an EV battery, right? These are cells that are typically matched. They have the exact same capacity. And that's because they're charged and discharged in series. But off of those assembly lines often come either damaged or not quite perfect, different temp, problem in the corner cells that typically are ground up into black mass and they're a cost. What we can do is we go to these OEMs and we can say, hey, you have your normal manufacturing process. You are embedding a battery management system into these batteries. Use ours. Why? Well, if you use our single cell control battery management system, it enables you to use these recycled non-EV grade non-match cells, which are notably cheaper. And they're like fantastic. So I can use cheaper material inputs and lower the cost that I sell to customers at. That's fantastic. And so it sort of carves out the supply side of these batteries for us, which obviously, as we know, is a really big problem in the electrification of stuff. The stuff is expensive, it's backlogged, everyone wants it, and that's sort of a nice dovetail in terms of what Entheos software does by empowering the OEMs to drive more business at lower cost.
So when we look at you mentioned a lot of these revolution of batteries, and I think we've had it on the show. We've spoke about it in a number of occasions where there's no doubt about that we will have batteries in many shapes or form. We have EVs, of course. We have the second-hand life. I work with Mercedes a lot on second-hand life batteries as well. You say there's a BMS system connected to the larger scale batteries for residential and industrial. So the software you have, how would you these are already coming, they're installed. Is it retrofitted, or from a business model, do you need to go to the OEMs and say this for all new ones, apply this? Because for me, software, the benefits of software is also the retrofitted and the ecosystem, because you cannot tie in anything any longer. Those are the days are over. So this open system kind of way. So how does that work?
Yeah, so I would again just double click on the fact that the battery management system form factors is fairly standardized at this point, right? It's a part of the supply chain, and we don't come at this problem with a hubris, which is use our system. It's a completely different form factor. Jam it into your assembly process, and then it'll be great for your customers. We really try to fit into existing standards that work pretty well for everyone. And so it's a much better fit, right, for the network if there are new battery orders that come in, right? Say if this battery developer finds a commercial situation, finds a client, the order goes to the OEM, and there's a new construction process, and they can embed the Rebel Core controller in there. It's a little bit more complicated, of course, this idea of retrofitting, right? If you speak to each and every individual cell, there are certain constructions that have to happen that make it difficult to go into a battery pack, open up the pack, and add this controller in a way that can fit seamlessly onto an existing battery. It's possible. But kind of what we solve for there, or what we try to do there, is say, hey, to be a part of kind of this network, to be a distributed energy resource in it that can access sort of the capital market side, it would of course be helpful if your battery had a Rebel Core controller on it for telemetry data, for battery optimization, et cetera, but it's actually not critical. We have a sort of another cloud suite, a software suite, that enables external devices that are non-Rebel Core fitted to interact with the network. As long as there's some telemetry data that's consistent and reliable, we have an agreement with the OEM and we have the docs of the battery. So it's certainly possible to sort of retrofit our network onto existing resources, but it's a little bit different. And what we like is the idea that the Rebel Core, it's actually enhancing the performance of the battery, right? Which makes it a better asset for capital markets. That piece is sort of key to us getting off the ground, we think, but it's certainly possible to interface with the broader environment of distributed energy resources.
Where do these resources sit? So you talked about family offices and folks investing in them. You talked about behind the grid, so maybe an industrial site or something like that. Where do they sit, and what does this look like? So when this OEM delivers something comes off a truck or something's built on my site, what's there?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So, for the most part, on this podcast, we've discussed kind of the CNI use case, right? A business behind the meter had a troubled 2022. They want some peak shaving from their battery, right? Depending on the size of the operation, the energy needs, that battery could be, a footprint of 5 by 5, or it could be a 20 by 8.5 shipping crate if it's an ice rink or a sports arena. And so what that'll look like is a shipping container, square profile, hopefully blends into the background, because we like our energy to be in the background, for people not to think about it, for them to be able to focus on their core businesses. But that sort of just does its thing autonomously and works for the customer without too much manual override. I think another sort of situation that we're focused on building a solution for is really servicing the independent power producers, whether it's renewables or wind. Right, a lot of these guys are producing a lot of energy at times when they can't sell it, and just as the night peak happens, the solar guys can't sell into that market. Right, bring storage to solar. The storage enhances the utilization of the solar. The solar enhances the value of the storage. That's sort of the power couple, I suppose, of the renewable revolution. So I would say those two sort of use cases are primary for our short term. But of course, there are interesting things happening, for example, on like the BTC mining side, as well as the data center side, as well as the grid scale side. And we'll sort of take those opportunities as they come. But we wouldn't want to be spread too thin. I think we acknowledge what our limits are, what our strengths are, what the technology can do today. We're just focused on getting a good product into the hands of folks that most need it in the near term.
What kind of delta in price do you need or capacity to get an ROI on this thing, let's say in 12 or 24? I don't know what kind of ROIs you guys are looking for someone to put one of these in. But how big a gap do I need to arbitrage or take care of that price with storage?
Yeah, so I think what your question really is what is sufficient variability in a grid to warrant an investor being interested in these projects? That's really what it is, right? The customer, they're paying some portion of the savings generated, whether the savings are tiny or the savings are huge, right? So there's always a benefit for the customer. The question is, does the platform, does the software create a battery asset that is interesting for capital markets? And so what you see here, right, is when we think about going out into the world and hopefully helping these customers, there's both a bottom-up process of identifying the customers. Maybe they come to us. We see that a lot. There's huge inflow. But also, there's a top-down process here too, right? There are certain situations that are simply better than other situations. So, at the beginning, we're really focused on those grids that are frankly the most dysfunctional, where the variability is the biggest. And early on, when Entheos is not a fully mature business, the first projects need to be really great, right? And so we're focused on those jurisdictions that have the biggest spread, i.e. the batteries are most valuable, such that the customers get the most savings and the investors have the biggest yield. And so depending on the jurisdiction, we see opportunities to save somewhere between 30 to 40%. That's not going to be all across the world. And those opportunities may dwindle over time as other storage enters the market. But an interesting dynamic here in this market, I think, and we'll see how it plays out, is renewables are only going to continue to proliferate, if not grow. And what that does is it adds potentially more variability to the supply side of these grids, which should mean that storage over time doesn't necessarily get less effective, even against a backdrop of other competitors. So that's kind of how we think about it. There's obviously got to be a sufficient yield to be interesting to investors, but I think our friends up at the White House in the States and the EU Council in the EU, they're sort of trying to solve for this as well with these extra incentives that tie out the financial equation for investors and really get these projects off the ground, even if the core yield isn't as good as you would hope it is.
So would you see? You mentioned the kind of the initial areas where this could be of interest. Do you see any specific regions? Do you see any specific cities, towns? How do you play this out? Where are you going to start? Where do you see this big difference that makes it a good area to start in?
Yeah, I think I'd love to say that, we've spent 3 months, profiling the entire world top down with various weighted factors and going into various grids. But, we're really focused on building a product that works for customers today. So I'd say a lot of this process is driven bottom up by folks who are following our technology, that have a need today, that come to us and they say, we have a lot of variability in our local grid. We don't want to draw from the grid during peaks. Please solve this problem for us. And so what that means is, Go
But is
ahead,
that
Johan.
I understand the need for it, but
Yeah.
for because the markets are slightly different, and you mentioned the difference between Europe and US in terms of adoptions, maybe of EVs or renewable. Do you see any specific region, be that in the US, that there's a bigger opportunity, there's a bigger spread today than there are in others, or
Yeah.
from a regional point of view, or from a city point of view? I understand the differences in terms of the value of it, but is there a specific regions? You're sitting in the sun. Is it more renewable down in Florida? Is that a place to start? Or help me out to understand where
Sure.
is a good place to start?
Yeah, so I think Florida is an okay market. I think, frankly, the European markets are the strongest from just a high level profile, given the renewables and the grid. I think Germany is a particularly strong market. I think Spain is a good market just because of the solar radiation and the proliferation of renewables. When you think about the states, right, the equation here is a little bit different. Some place like Texas, actually, even with the proliferation of wind, particularly in West Texas, what you see is not the largest arbitrage opportunities. That market is pretty built out, as is California. There's a lot of money in those markets, but they're much further ahead, right? Whereas if you see a market like the Northeast, the Northeast is doing really well on proliferation of renewables, but really not well on storage, right? And so the disconnect of those two things means a market like that is prime to go in there with a solution. But I think, for us, given our background, really Europe is more prime. We just, hired a few folks in the States to build out that market. But it hasn't been as easy to find fantastic markets, at least in California and Texas, which is the natural place to start. But there are fantastic markets in the States that have that sort of disconnect between renewables and sufficient grid scale and C&I storage.
Where do you go from here? You're building new markets out. You've got a young company that's looking to solve a problem for the industry. So what's next for you?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we're just on the back of a fundraising round, which will allow us to refocus on building a business. Imagine that. And so what we're really focused on is building out and bringing comfort to the various stakeholders that are critical to a battery project. And what that means at the beginning, because the platform isn't up and running, is sort of role playing the different roles and understanding what each requires, doing it ourselves, such that we can then build a toolkit, sort of a franchise model that allows for external stakeholders to come and sit in the platform and deliver a product that isn't a compromise. It's still a pristine product. So what that really means is we're spending each and every day with customers understanding their needs. We're spending each and every day with hedge funds understanding what sort of battery assets they need to be interested in deploying money. So it's really about just knocking on doors, hitting the pavement, sort of proselytizing and getting people into the platform so we can start to give rise to this new asset class, storage as a service.
What would make storage as a service not take off? What would be a headwind that would be insurmountable?
An insurmountable headwind. Well, we like to think that no headwinds are insurmountable, but yeah, I think there's a little bit of an interesting dynamic, and I want to try to make sure not to get too close to the secret sauce, but there's this dynamic which is you approach a customer who has a storage need, and you say, "Look, we'll install this storage. It solves this problem for you, drives you this savings." And some external investor will own the battery. And they say, well, why would they want to own the battery? And what you say is, well, the battery is a fairly productive asset. It drives a lot of savings. And they have a thesis and certain return hurdles to hit. And then the customer's like, well, I don't want someone else to own the battery. I want to own the battery outright, right? And so there's an element which is like, you provide that choice, which is the storage as a service is a much more economically reasonable proposition. But because of human psychology, folks don't want to miss out on the quality of these batteries. Now, that's not a bad case for us, right? Our business thus far is partnering with OEMs. They sell batteries to customers with our software, and we take a margin on that. That's a good business, right? But we don't think it inherently scales because not everyone can access it. But there is an interesting dynamic at the closing table where a customer may be dissuaded from entering the storage as a service platform because they recognize the sheer economics that are at play here and they'll sort of just be paralyzed as opposed to doing either, if that makes sense.
No, I think it's an interesting view, and as we discussed during the show in terms of this transition and the growth of solar, the growth of renewable, the growth of wind in general, and that the need of storage in one way or the other. I think producing the batteries is one thing. EVs is going there, but this kind of bridging this ecosystem and also creating the value, I think it's really interesting to hear a lot of the business models. Usually we talk about the technology behind storage, and even if we touched a lot on the software that enhanced the batteries, I was really interesting to hear about the business models around it. That's kind of my heart lies as well. So I thought this was really, really interesting. It was a pleasure to have you on. I know we're coming up for time. Just maybe one last question. I know I always have one, but maybe a quick answer to this one. I know it's a difficult one to have a quick answer to, but we got a lot of companies coming in. You got the investments. You've also got the big battery producers now coming in, and surely they are also looking at similar solution to especially large grid scale. So do you see collaboration with them, or do you see that they might be competitors to doing kind of the same thing as you, but maybe more from a capex investment?
Yeah, look, so it's a good question, right? Are the existing interests out there cooperative or competitive? We focus on the cooperative side. The goal of a workflow that aligns different stakeholders is to make each and every one of those stakeholders' lives or businesses better, right? Not to compete with them directly. So, an interesting model would be something like a franchise. Why would a supplier of, furniture or food want to supply those resources to a Hilton franchise? Well, if the Hilton franchise takes off, if the Entheos Energy franchise takes off, then it improves their bottom line, allows them to sell more, right? So our goal at this stage is to be a helpful and useful partner to all these different stakeholders to drive towards their bottom line, right? Drive them more business, proliferate more solar, more wind, and more storage at scale.
Well, Teach, it has been a pleasure having you on the podcast. It's been an interesting journey through this conversation. I look forward to hearing more about your company as it matures, to see what plays out and how it all goes. Time will tell, but it seems like an interesting space to be in. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, guys, thank you so much. It was an absolute pleasure to be here, and I look forward to the next one day.
For our audience, we hope you've enjoyed this content as much as we've had. It's been fun to make. If you enjoy the content, like it, share it, add comments, follow us on Twitter. Don't forget about our Facebook group, and we will see you again next week. Bye-bye.